So, hello everybody. Welcome for this event. My name is Jairaj Sundareshan. I teach in the Department of Geography and Environment at the LSE. I am a volunteer with the Decolonizing LSE Collective. This talk is organized by the Decolonizing LSE Collective. This is a collective of staff and students across LSE. This talk is part of our Lent-term series. Please check for more coming up in our website, our Twitter accounts, Instagram and Facebook for the forthcoming talks. In all of this we are as Decolonizing LSE, so you can find very easily. Today we are really honored to have Aimable Amani Lameke from DRC, Dr. Gauthier Marchais from IDS Sussex, and Christian Bazouzi from DRC to talk to us on the title of their talk is Reflecting on Race and Whiteness in International Research Partnerships. Aimable Amani Lameke is a director of Marakuja Kivu Research. Please excuse my difficult pronunciations, my accent also. Aimable Amani Lameke is a director of Marakuja Kivu Research. As a researcher, he has spent 13 years of experience researching the social, economic, and political transformation in Eastern DRC, and he has worked with a range of Congolese, European, and North American universities and research institutions. Dr. Gauthier Marchais is a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex. He works on social transformation in context of violent conflict. His current research focuses on education in context of protracted violence, with a focus on the provinces of South Kivu and Tanganyika in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Christian Bazouzi is a researcher on rural development. He has more than 10 years of experience in mixed methods academic research across provinces of Eastern DRC. He has expertise on monitoring and evaluation of humanitarian projects and has worked in conflict-affected areas, including on non-state armed groups. He is currently a research supervisor at Marakuja Kivu Research and a trainer and supervisor of the Crisis Observatory Program of the World Bank. So, welcome all of you and the speakers, and they would speak for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then we will have chance to ask Q&A and also a larger discussions, and Gauthier will talk about it more. And I think Gauthier is going to translate from Aimable and Christian as the talk proceeds. This talk is being recorded, but the Q&A will not be recorded, and the recording will be made available through all our social media outlets. Over to you, Gauthier, Aimable, and Christian.
Thanks a lot, Raj, and thanks for inviting us, and thanks to the Decolonize LSE Collective for inviting us. So I'm going to share my screen with a presentation. So is it working? So can you hear me?
Working.
Yes, yeah. It's working. Okay, great. Thanks a lot. So yes, we're going to be doing a presentation first, and then a discussion, which I hope will be an open discussion. Aimable and Paulin will be intervening during the presentation in French, and I'll be doing the translation. And please let me know if I go over time. We haven't timed ourselves for this presentation. So I guess we can start. We wanted to dedicate this presentation to our friend Jean-Paul Zibika, who was a colleague working with us for several years and who left us last year. So We're going to be presenting an article which is called "The Data is Gold and We Are the Gold Diggers, Whiteness, Race and Contemporary Academic Research in Eastern DRC." It's an article that we wrote quite a few years ago, actually, and which came out in September 2020 in Critical African Studies as part of a special issue on decolonizing African studies, which was edited by Chose Kesi, Zoe Marks, and Elelwani Ramugondo, which I highly recommend for those interested in these issues. And so we're going to present the article, the key points of the article, and then hopefully have a wider discussion with people intervening with their own experiences. So about the article itself, there were two steps in writing the article. I did a first draft initially as part of a reflection on the architecture of whiteness. I'll be talking about that in a second. But the first draft was very much inspired by discussions we had been having with Aimable and Paulin throughout the years of working together. And then we had a second round of structured review and discussion of the first draft that led to a second draft, which was eventually submitted. Okay, so just taking a bit of a step back, the first question is, what can a white man say about race? There has been a long literature on the fact that race is to a certain extent invisible to white people, and we can think, of course, of the work of Charles Mills, Stuart Hall, Gloria Wecker, Peggy McIntosh, Robin DiAngelo. So a lot of people who have written about race have highlighted this invisibility of race for white people. Here, of course, I'm talking about European conceptions of race, which are not the only ones, but which are particularly important to understand because they've had impacts throughout the world and continue to have impacts throughout the world. And the idea of an essay which I wrote a few years ago as well, which recently came out in France, called Le Déni Blanc, Penser autrement la question raciale, which was originally titled actually Leaving the White House being the mental architecture of race. But I couldn't keep that title because it came out on the 21st of January, the day after Donald Trump left the White House, so it would have been a bit of a confusion there. But the idea of the essay, so that essay is a non-academic essay, so it's a bit of a more personal philosophical reflection on whiteness, but it's to trace what I would call the cognitive, social, and affective architecture of whiteness from within. So from my perspective. And this article was written, this paper was written as in that same kind of idea, basically, to try to see how whiteness operates in the context of research and in the context of international partnerships. And for the paper, so just for definitions in the paper, we use a definition of whiteness from Van Zyl, Herman, and Boer-Sema. They define whiteness as a configuration of power, privilege, and identity consisting of white racialized ideologies and practices with material and social ramifications. So before we start, I think it's important to, first of all, I think the discussion about whiteness is important. So because for quite a long time, there were relatively few discussions about that entire aspect of the debates on race. It also has inherent limitations, I think. The most important of which is that it could lead to a kind of recentering of whites and whiteness in debates on race, and that could be to a certain extent problematic, but we can talk about this more in the discussion. And I think that, so we're going to be talking about the context of Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. But more generally, I think that there is a tendency for white Western researchers who work on the African continent, a particular tendency to think themselves out of race in a particular way. And I would say that, first of all, it's because in terms of their or our positionality, we are usually quite aware of the all the issues around the white savior complex that, you know, many of us might have observed in the sphere of NGOs and development. And we try to tend to position ourselves differently and say, you know, we are just here to understand. There's a kind of idea of neutrality of understanding in these contexts, which is, of course, very problematic because we know from a long history of European knowledge produced about the African continent that understanding is in no way neutral, and that, you know, the disciplines of the social sciences, from anthropology to geography to history to political science, served in their time to construct the categories and to construct the kind of forms of knowledge through which colonial power invested the continent. And to a certain extent, it's still very much the case today. I think there is another tendency, and here I'm seeing this a little bit provocatively to a certain extent, for white academics to think themselves out of race, which would be that they're so aware of it, so aware of colonial history and race, that they would somehow think themselves out of it by that very process. I'll come back to this a little bit. But of course, race and whiteness permeate a lot of what, a lot of the knowledge that is produced by so-called Western academia about and on the African continent. And here I'm going to be, a lot of the terms that I'm using, such as Western, all of that are in quotation marks, of course, because we know that they're in many cases inherently problematic. And that, of course, Western researchers are not necessarily white, but here I'm talking specifically about white Western researchers. So we can see several kind of dimensions of race in the academic research that is produced about the African continent in so-called Western academia. The first, I would say, is the level of the ontologies, the level of the epistemologies, the level of the methodologies that are kind of used and deployed in these contexts, which can be marked in many cases by what Gurminder Bambra calls methodological whiteness, which is a fundamental tendency to misconstrue race and coloniality in approaches. And of course, there is a very kind of particular genealogy of doing that with regards to the African continent, which has been the object of long-standing, of course, racism and racialized forms of knowledge. So there's an interesting article by Maria Eriksen Baz and Judith Verwegen called Confronting the Colonial, where they show that the very conceptual apparatuses that are summoned and deployed to study issues around, for example, security on the African continent or conflict on the African continent, have very clear colonial genealogies. So that's a first level, so basically the level of ontologies, epistemologies, methodologies. A second level, I would say, is the political economy of knowledge and knowledge production. And here, and particularly in the cases that we'll be talking about, an important aspect of it is the interrelationship between academic knowledge and the development sector, which is, of course, not all of research that is produced in this context, but an important part of it at the moment. And we know that the development sector and development more broadly is, you know, very problematic with regards to coloniality and race. We know that there are knowledge hierarchies and very clear knowledge hierarchies, and this idea of expert knowledge, which has been studied by Arturo Escobar and various authors, and a very interesting set of contributions recently by Olivia Rutazibwa about the question of who gets invited to the table, who is considered as an expert in the production of this knowledge. And in many cases, the people who get invited to that table are white, so there is a racialized dimension of that. And there have been contributions, of course, about the silence around issues of race in development and development knowledge. We can think about the book of Kalpana Wilson. We can think about the contributions of Arathiri Sriprakash, Leon Tilke, and Sharon Walker around the erasure of race in development. And I think this is something to take into account very fundamentally at the moment. I'll come back to that at the very end of the presentation. But at the moment, the role of development funding in relationship to academic knowledge is changing. And I think it's very important to track those changes and how they're influencing knowledge production. Because, for example, we've been seeing much more funding, which is joint funding. For example, in the UK, the fact that the research councils are co-funding with development money, big programs. We can think about the GCRF, UKRI, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a kind of changing configuration, which is important to track. So that's the second level, which I would say is the political economy of knowledge production. So what are the interests behind knowledge production and in these type of contexts? And the third level, I would say, is the social context of research, which is the social interactions and relationships that happen via these types of projects, so these international partnerships, and happen at several levels, in fieldwork, in international conferences, in European universities or US universities. So a social context that happens across different sites, which is also marked by dynamics of race and whiteness, including in this presentation. There has been relatively little about whiteness and race in these types of contexts, and generally relatively little actually written about whiteness on the African continent, with the notable exception of South Africa. There's a very interesting special issue of Africa in 2017 called "The Politics of Whiteness in Africa" that kind of centers these debates. So there's relatively little. It's relatively new literature, I would say, apart from the South African case. And there's even less on academics and academia per se. Okay, so please let me know if anything is unclear or if you can't hear me or anything like that. So what we do in this article is we trace the kind of birth and development of an organization which is called Marakuja Kivu Research, of which Aimable Amani Lameke is the director, which is an ISBL, so a non-profit organization that is based in Goma in North Kivu in the DRC, which is specialized in doing research in DRC and particularly doing research in the conflict-affected provinces of the East. This organization emerged in the context of a relative boom in demand for research on the eastern provinces of the DRC. Itself tied to the fact that with the kind of rise of how do you say, empirical driven programming in the NGO and development spheres, there was quite a demand for large scale studies of issues around poverty, conflict, et cetera, by development actors. So there was quite a demand for this type of research. So Marakuja emerged in this context, and it was and is still constituted by both Congolese and European and North American researchers. And it emerged. What's important, I think, to note is that it emerged with an active or almost activist stance to kind of counter the racialized professional hierarchies that exist in DRC. So many of the Congolese researchers who started Marakuja had experiences in the NGO world or in the development world, which is very present and prevalent in Eastern DRC. Which is marked very much by racialized professional hierarchies and by various forms of, racism and various kind of racialized interactions and professional interactions. And the idea was really to explicitly counter that by the creation of this organization. And there were two principles behind this DIY kind of nowtopia, which were first a commitment to academic research, and an egalitarian ethos built on strong interpersonal bonds and shared experience. We spent several months doing fieldwork in rural Eastern DRC. We developed, this kind of strong personal bonds and which constituted the basis of this idea of an egalitarian ethos and the idea of building an enclave against these racially structured professional hierarchies in the region. And I think, here again saying this a little bit provocatively, but I think this is one of the ways in which certain organizations or certain sites also tend to think themselves out of race, in the sense that, you know, we constitute this bubble. We're not like the others who have these, you know, problems of race and all that. We're different, and actually, well, that's not the case. So what we do in the article is we try to then trace the way in which race returned within this organization, but actually it was always there. But so it's not returned, but it's maybe became more visible within the organization and within the research, the international research projects that were associated with this organization. And we're not necessarily talking in this presentation or in the article itself of, you know, specific people or of specific projects. It's really tendencies that we see throughout. And we try to trace this as this organization was fitted to some extent, or took the shape of what we call the international research value chain. There is an article by Desai and Tapscott, which calls it the supply chain. But basically, this configuration where with a configuration which mirrors other industries or other sectors, of course, where there is the collection of a primary resource. In this case, the primary resource is data or information in places like Eastern DRC, which is then exported internationally, usually to European or US-based universities, and transformed into high-value goods or resources, which are typically reports, academic articles, which we know are actually, you know, what universities trade in and what careers are made of. So there is really a kind of value-added process to this international process. So basically, we try to trace the different ways in which race reappears in that context. Race was, of course, already actually present, although not necessarily visible to everyone in the organization, and particularly to whites, people in the organization, was present from the onset. And we look at, for example, the underlying differences that might exist in professional and economic prospects. So the people who created this organization were usually PhDs. I was doing my PhD. So we were already, you know, in a kind of path towards an academic career, whereas the Congolese researchers were facing much more complex professional conditions, because it's, I mean, there are lots of, you know, barriers to building an academic career in Eastern DRC, and in the particular context of Eastern DRC, higher education. And so we also try to start tracing how differentiated experiences of the research project, of the same research project, also started to generate racialized differences. And one of these is the nature of the work, particularly as, for example, the white Western researchers came back to Europe or came back to the United States, and their work mainly consisted of working, you know, at the library, on their computer at home, as we've been doing for quite a few months now, on the internet. So that was the experience of work. And that experience of work also produces a high visibility of the outputs that are produced through that, that are shared through, you know, emails, etc., or papers that are produced. So a high visibility of the kind of white side of this configuration. Of course, it's not necessarily so. It's not necessarily white, non-white, etc. It's a bit more complex than that. But here I'm talking about it a bit schematically. And on the other side, the Congolese researchers who were doing field work and had a completely different set of type of work, and one that is particularly complex in Eastern DRC because there is ongoing violent conflict in the region, and field work is very complicated in the Kivus. So basically, a work where there was considerable work that had to be done around negotiating and organizing what we can call the research transaction, which is basically obtaining information, and that demands considerable work on, first of all, security, access, triangulation, making sure that the respondent is safe, making sure that as a researcher, one is safe, making sure that everything around ethics and all of that around that transaction, which demands considerable work, but that work is largely invisible if we think about visibility and invisibility of the work that is produced with regards to the wider project. So these types of clear kind of differences and differentiated experiences. And one very important aspect, which was highlighted also in an article by Conan Furman and Lake in 2018, which is the fact that risk is clearly unequally distributed in this particular division of labor and work within these projects, and itself revelatory of a racially structured regime of inequality. And what is race if not unequal distribution of risk? And we actually had some very clear example in the last months on projects that we were working on with Paulin Bazouzi, where basically I'm sitting here in London in my room in front of my computer working on a project, and one of the field researchers was one of the researchers who was on the field at that time was held up at gunpoint. So I mean, that's just a very clear illustration of the differentiated exposure to risk within these types of projects. And another important thing is that so I'm seeing that people are entering and I'm admitting them at the same time. So another aspect which is important is that work pressure, which we know is typical of contemporary academic projects and contemporary academic work, is refracted and resonates very differently across this kind of across these international research projects. On one side, if you have a high level pressure, it might mean you on the European side, it might mean that you need to pull an all-nighter or work during the weekends, and of course that can generate stress and burnout and all that. But on the Congolese side, it might mean actually reducing all those very important aspects of what I called, negotiating the research transaction and issues around security and access. So pressure might reduce those to the level where there is even higher exposure to risk. So, and I think moments of crisis in a project and moments of stress are actually much more revelatory, because that's when the kind of more racialized dimensions come out. So here Aimable and Paulin, if you can hear me, so I can't see the entire set of people because I'm sharing my screen, are going to share some aspects of this, and I'm going to translate it. Aimable, si tu m'entends, est-ce que tu peux intervenir à ce moment? Oui, on te reçoit, mais c'est pas très fort. Peut-être si tu peux mettre ta caméra et essayer de parler près du micro. Je ne sais pas si c'est la connexion.
Un problème de connexion ici. Donc, de mon côté, moi, c'est Aimable Amani. Je suis le directeur de Marakuja, une structure qui est une organisation basée à Goma, en RDC, qui travaille dans le cadre des collectes de recherche et collecte de données. Il a pris plusieurs partenaires à pouvoir mener le projet de recherche, et aussi les organisations humanitaires à pouvoir évaluer leur projet de développement. Alors, tel qu'on vient de faire la présentation, donc de notre côté, nous pouvons juste appuyer nous pouvons juste confirmer l'exposé que vous venez de faire. Peut-être s'il y a des questions relatives à la présente présentation sur lesquelles nous pouvons répondre. Vraiment, ils sont les bienvenus.
Merci Aimable. Et je pense les points que tu avais soulevés dans notre discussion, justement par rapport à ces expériences-là,
Oui.
avec des chercheurs blancs qui viennent à l'est de la RDC, si tu peux les présenter, je les traduirai.
Oui, oui. C'est sûr, ça fait un bon nombre de temps qu'on travaille avec différents chercheurs, parmi lesquels ceux qui viennent des universités européennes ou américaines. Donc, on a quand même réussi à travailler avec un nombre suffisant, parmi lesquels il y a eu des personnes avec qui on a développé de très bonnes relations. Il y a d'autres personnes, bon, on s'est vraiment, on a fourni de nos efforts jusqu'au dernier point pour que le projet juste puisse aller jusqu'à la fin. Et là, vous sentez parfois, vous travaillez sans vous. On a vécu, par exemple, pour certains projets où on essaye, on trouve parfois le traitement n'est pas presque égal. Parfois, vous avez la compétence en un tel domaine, mais vous trouvez la considération que l'on vous donne. Bon, parfois, c'est la sous-estimation de vos compétences. Et là, ça ne marche pas. Parfois, il y a d'autres personnes qui viennent et qui estiment que ils connaissent tout et ils ne peuvent rien espérer d'un chercheur congolais. Bon, peut-être que sauf le chercheur congolais, il peut faire le rôle d'enquêteur, il peut aller sur le terrain pour collecter les données. À part ça, il ne peut rien d'autre faire. Si vous avez une expérience antérieure, même si vous avez les capacités, même si c'est pas quoi, bon, on ne sait pas ce qui s'est dit peut-être en dehors de la RDC. Peut-être les diplômes, les personnes qui sont passées à l'école en RDC, ils n'ont pas de niveau. Bon, pourtant, en réalité, c'est pas ça. Donc, on peut avoir quand même des personnes qui sont capables de faire quelque chose. Et donc, c'est cette confiance-là qui manque parfois. Mais sûrement, ce n'est pas pour tout le monde. Il y a personnes qui arrivent et que vous trouvez vraiment, ils vous donnent la considération. Tout ce que vous pouvez faire, ça passe. Parfois, c'est un déséquilibre sur le plan, par exemple, salarial. Vous trouvez pour une expertise X que vous pouvez fournir, ou même là, on, est, on ne valorise pas tout ce qui peut provenir d'un chercheur congolais. On essaie juste de valoriser tout ce qui peut venir d'ailleurs, même en termes de traitement. Vous faites la même chose si c'est la programmation qui a été faite par un chercheur congolais. Bon, vous trouvez un programmeur, il est programmé, il est évalué à sa tâche peut-être quelque chose comme 300-400 $. Et quand cette même tâche est couverte par quelqu'un de l'étranger, vous trouvez que c'est quelque chose qui est considéré, qui est pris vraiment avec une valeur supérieure. Mais ce qui est sûr est que ce n'est pas quelque chose de général. Il y a des cas particuliers. On a par exemple des cas récents, on a eu un chercheur avec lequel on a travaillé qui est venu pour un projet imposé. Il dit non, moi je suis bon, vous savez, Marakuja sans moi, vous ne pouvez rien. Et pourtant, Marakuja a existé peut-être 4 et 5 ans avant qu'ils ne viennent. Et là, on gagnait des marchés, on les exécutait. Il arrive, il dit non, il faut trouver une maison pour moi. La maison que vous lui présentez vous dit non, cette maison n'est pas conforme pour moi. Il faut trouver une maison où le logement il est complètement séparé du bureau. Comme ça, aucun Congolais ne passera. Ne peut passer là où je réside. Donc, on peut juste se rencontrer au bureau, mais personne ne peut arriver là où je réside. Bon. Et pourtant, notre bureau à l'époque n'était pas conçu comme ça. C'était un bureau où ça jouait les deux rôles au même moment. Juste le salon jouait le rôle du bureau et le reste de la maison est un guest. Bon, étant donné qu'on n'a pas beaucoup d'administration, bon, vous trouvez quelqu'un qui commence à vous considérer comme ça, c'est tout le monde qui est réticent. Et quand ils vous parlent, ce sont des ordres seulement. Ça, c'est un cas vraiment le plus récent qu'on a vécu. On a vécu un autre cas, vous allez sur terrain, vous avez un traitement X. Quand vous essayez de déclarer que non, ces conditions ne sont pas adaptées pour continuer notre travail, on vous dit vous n'avez qu'à comme ça. Mais du coup, quelques jours après, il y a quelqu'un d'autre qui vient, mais qui n'est pas alors de votre équipe, qui n'est pas congolais du moins. Bon, vous trouvez que ça change automatiquement, alors qu'on vous disait qu'il n'y a pas. Le budget se retrouve pour couvrir mais peut-être même 10 fois cher que les dépenses de 2, 3, 4 personnes qui étaient là. Donc, c'est un peu ça, c'est juste en bref. On ne peut pas vraiment citer directement les noms des individus, mais au moins c'est une expérience vraiment que nous avons.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, je vais traduire ça.
Oui.
So Aimable was sharing some experiences which had been discussed for this article, but also more recent experiences of this of these kind of racialized dimensions of these international research projects. Notably around differences in salaries. I think this is really a fundamental aspect of this of this entire issue. Around, for example, differences in salaries at equal level of competences, which I think is a very kind of clear marker of racialized difference. Of repeated, and so Aimable was nuancing, so he was saying that it's not systematic and it really depends on different people, but in some cases there was very blatant disconsideration basically for the competences of the Congolese researchers who have much more experience of working in the region. Somebody arriving, a white Western researcher arriving and basically not taking into account in any way their competences on the topics that they were going to work on, and actually giving orders and these types of things. So the disconsideration of their expertise and understanding, various occurrences of even orders being given, also differentiated experiences of basically the working conditions and the lodging conditions. So basically, white Western researchers, staying in large hotels and these types of things. So a range of things that we do talk about in the article, which very much I think continue to play out in the context of these types of projects. And which is the third level, I think, which I was talking about, which is the social dimension of these racialized problems. So I'm just going to continue because I'm wary of time. I know we're still relatively okay with time, but we can come back, of course, to concrete examples in the discussion. And yes, so. Continuing with the presentation, but now my screen is blocked. Why is it not moving from one to the next? Come on. Sorry, everyone. Okay, so yes, so basically what we try to do in the article is to use the fact that we have several perspectives on this issue, that we had discussions with Paula and Aimable. And the several perspectives, I think, were actually key in being able to identify how things worked, how these racialized dynamics worked, because obviously as a white person, I have a lot of blind spots on these issues. And so it's through these conversations that we identified these mechanisms. And what we also do is try to trace the kind of cognitive and discursive repertoires that are summoned to activate racialized forms of differences. For example, and this is something that I think, bouncing back on one thing that Aimable was saying, he said at one point, we don't know where these decisions were being made. We don't know what type of conversations are happening in the US and in Europe around these issues, for example, salaries and these types of things. And actually, I was able to know, what kind of conversations were happening elsewhere, and I could also see the types of arguments that were circulating in other spheres, in a sense. And so we tried to trace some of the key arguments that were summoned in this type of case. So first of all, a tendency to ignore or minimize underlying differences in working conditions. So these kind of key differences in the types of work that is being done when you're sitting in front of a computer in London, and the difference with operating in Eastern DRC. Arguments that revolved around the idea of the commensurability of work. So for example, white Western researchers saying, we're working a lot on this, and that you should work as much. So assuming that basically on the other side, there isn't that much work, whereas actually there is that entirely invisible part of work, which I was talking about before. And bordering in several cases on implicit hierarchies between intellectual work versus manual work. So basically things like field work being implicitly considered as something close to manual work, whereas we know that it's not at all. Field work and these types of things are integral in the entire intellectual process of academic research. Arguments that revolved around the idea that the commitment to academic research should supersede considerations about money. And this is something that I saw a lot, arguments coming out about the fact that Congolese researchers should not be paid too much. And it's interesting because there are a lot of arguments that come out in those cases, which are like things like, if you pay people too much, then it will distort the economy in Eastern DRC. Or if you pay people too much, then there will be, kind of interests or greed basically coming in, and it will distort the project. So a lot of assumptions basically about Congolese society, which are definitely racialized and which actually have a long genealogy of, how basically these types of societies are conceived. And within this unequal bargaining power within the projects, because these types of international research projects, usually there is very clear unequal bargaining power in terms of decision making within the projects. So I'm not going to go to all the details of these, and Aimable spoke about a few of the manifestations, but the idea is really to show that race is a kind of, first of all, it's a cognitive and discursive repertoire that can be used a bit strategically by white researchers to activate a particular mode of production, itself actually built on structural underlying imbalances in terms, for example, of salaries, in terms, for example, of working conditions and these types of things. And what's characteristic of this repertoire, and I think the ways in which, so thinking about the ways in which whiteness operates, is that you can move in and out of it. And it's also in a tension to a certain extent with conscious efforts to offset it. So as I said, there was this kind of post-racial ethos, or supposedly post-racial ethos, or this idea that, within this organization or within this project, everybody is equal, and we're actually actively trying to promote that. So even with that stance, basically, you can still move to a repertoire which is basically available, which is there, sometimes almost unconsciously, just to kind of tap on that particular resource. And that, I think, is one of the ways, in which kind of whiteness operates in these contexts. And it's important to underline the fact that it's not deterministic. It's subject to considerable play, and it can be more or less acute. The extractive configuration of these international research projects can be more or less acute, depending on a range of things, from deadlines to the way that resources are distributed within the project, to time and these types of things. But I'll come back to that a little bit later. Okay. So one of the other things that we do in the article, and this was a very interesting part of the discussions that we were having with Aimable and Paulin in writing this article, is what are the implications basically in terms of the products of the research itself, in terms of ontologies, in terms of methods, in terms of concepts. So the type of pressure which is characteristic of contemporary research projects with, you know, very strict deadlines and all that means that, as I said, pressure is refracted in differentiated ways across this kind of international value chain of international research projects. And it manifests itself for people working in the field, so collecting data in the field and these types of things, in substantial reduction of all the amount of invisible work that goes into managing the research transaction in places like Eastern DRC. And that's fundamental work of conceptual verification, of translation, of a range of things that are actually integral to actually ensuring that there is some form of validity of the concepts and of the ideas that are circulating through these projects, right? And things like fatigue and disengagement can be experienced and has been experienced, and that's something that Paulin insisted on a lot in the discussions leading up to this article. Disengagement basically means that I think that bad concepts can circulate back and forth through these research projects. So I'm just going to explain that a bit. Bad concepts, I think, are concepts, particularly in the field of development. There are a range of concepts like community, like village, like, I don't know, resilience, like all of these kind of, you know, generic development concepts. Many of them are actually problematic in their generic form. A concept like community is, of course, a very, very complex concept and very much applicable, I think, to a region like Eastern DRC, but not in its generic form. The generic conception of community, I think, actually embeds a lot of assumptions about social life in Africa. So this idea that, you know, there would be these kind of communities in the village that are, you know, nice and well organized. These types of conceptions have a very long-standing and racialized genealogy. And so concepts like that in a context of these international research value chains can be validated because we need to think about the dimension of empirical validation here, because this is a context where there has been the empirical turn in the social sciences and in these types of projects. The idea is that you collect data, you collect information in the field, you do focus groups, you do interviews, and that is basically the empirical basis of the, there's an echo. That is basically the empirical validation of your ideas, of your theories, of, you know, of the very concepts that are at the core of academic knowledge. And there is this idea that with, you know, these empirical methodologies that came about very strongly in the 2000s and that are very much prevalent today in the social sciences and these types of projects, there is empirical validation and verification of these concepts, except that in this particular political economy, particularly if there is fatigue and disengagement from the entire work that is necessary to kind of check the conceptual validity of these concepts, these bad concepts can be empirically validated and reproduce, you know, very problematic conceptions of places like Eastern DRC, which can themselves be racialized. So I think it can lead to a kind of empirically validated conceptual misinformation, which has a strong, you know, racialized character. So yes, so I wanted to bring up a few points for the conclusion. So first of all, this idea that race operates in a tension between conscious efforts to offset it. So this idea, you know, of building, you know, post-racial kind of context. The term post-racial is, of course, extremely problematic, but more like actively trying to fight racialized hierarchies or racialized inequalities within the context of these projects can operate in a tension with actually the ways in which it's ingrained and reappears and can be reactivated in these research projects. The second conclusion is that race is not just a remnant of a past era that needs to be shaken off. And I think that's one of the problematic, ways to conceive race, that, the colonial era is over, imperialism is over, massive quotation marks there. There are still remnants, here and there of that past era that we just need to kind of make sure that we kill off and, not reproduce. That's not actually the case. So what we try to argue is that it continues to serve almost as a technology, as a mode of production, which is very much built into contemporary research projects. And it's, in that sense, it's very, very alive as a mode of production. And thus, I think, one of the key questions that international research partnerships operating, working in these types of contexts need to ask themselves is, do they rely on race as a regime of inequality? Do they rely on racially structured inequalities for their work? And I think that's not an easy question to answer, and it's a fundamental question to address. So a little bit about wider considerations. I think in a region like Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, these international research projects produce a lot of the knowledge that is currently quite, dominant about the region. So it's a region where there are excellent universities, and we've been working with universities a lot recently, excellent researchers in Congolese universities, an entire kind of tradition of academic work. But these universities have experienced the crisis of the African universities, which started notably in the 1980s, where there was mass defunding, the crisis of the public sector, which happened throughout many African countries. And thus, I think what is most problematic at the moment, if we think more broadly about the fact that these international research projects, the problem is that they're producing a lot of the knowledge that is produced about the region. If they were just producing a bit of the knowledge, and that most of the knowledge was produced by the universities in South Kivu and North Kivu, I don't think it would be that problematic, except for the dynamics that I talked about. But in this case, the fact that the knowledge that is produced in this context has a wide impact and is, to a certain extent, the dominant international knowledge produced about the region is extremely problematic and is the most problematic aspect of it. So yes, I think we can leave it here, because I think we can start the discussion. I had a few more points, but I think I can insert them in the discussion. And yes, so we're going to leave it here. And I hope we can have a discussion where people share their own experiences and their own challenges on these issues, because it's, we don't have any answers to these complex questions. So thanks a lot. And we can start the discussion. I'm gonna
thank you very much,
so that I can see everyone.
Gauthier. Yeah, great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aimable, Gauthier, and Christine, for this fantastic, thought-provoking talk. So we have an hour, and as Gauthier said, we can have questions. There is chat here, so you can post questions in the chat, ideas, or if you want to ask the question straight, please raise your hand, and I'm happy to. You can unmute yourself and ask. So, I mean, maybe I can start by asking one question, and it's just, yeah, John Clark. Can I complete my question and then you can come back? Is that okay?
Sorry, yes, of course.
Yeah, thanks. when I was doing my fieldwork long years ago for my PhD in Bangalore, someone told me, in fact, that there are a few slum communities in Bangalore who decided not to talk to white Western researchers. And it was interesting, because in my field, broadly speaking, the urban studies, a large amount of the ideas and arguments and whatnot has been developed by studying slums, literally, particularly on India. And it's very hard to find people who have not on that kind of particular specialization. And then, and I couldn't meet actually these people who literally said that they won't talk to white researchers because I don't work on slums, I don't research on slums. But the interesting point was that made me think quite a lot of things, that, this idea of gold digging that you said as data, isn't it? And what do people do with that data? And, we research, convert it into publications. And most of the people who are, for instance, brown like me, who would be going to study the people in the slums, are not coming from, mostly the low caste background, etc., etc. Large kind of that power relation too, even if it's not the white Western researchers. And what do we do with our thing? We publish in these papers and make our careers, or maybe at the most advise some kind of UN, World Bank type groups, development agencies. So, and over the years, many years in London and across the academic community, I've never met anyone who lived in a slum to get an admission in any of these universities. All right. So, so it's connected to some of these things that you said earlier. And what do we do with this research? How does this? It's not just about the act of research, but what is coming out of research, not just the ideas, but does this whole process itself, in that sense, continually perpetuate these inequalities, right? And so it would be nice to know from you that reflection on that. Do you like to take more questions together, or respond one by one, Gauthier and Aimable and Christian? How do you like it? Do you like to? Yeah.
Yes, I think maybe we can take a few questions.
A few.
I think, generally, as I said before, we're very happy to answer the questions and various questions, but we definitely do not have all the answers on these issues. So if people want to share their own experiences or the ways that they addressed these things, because I don't think we'll have definitive answers to that. I think, just to bounce back very quickly on what you were just saying, Jay Raj, I think there is really a question of whether these configurations are perpetuating and or reinstating to a certain extent those configurations. That's the key question. Or should they be done away with entirely, I guess, which some people argue definitely should be the case, or should they be reformed in various ways? But the talk of reforming, the talk of addressing inequalities within these projects, or epistemic diversity within these projects has gained some ground, but it's also actively kind of opposed by the structural dynamics that underlie these projects, and particularly around funding, the fact that the way that funding is changed, the fact that funding is tied to loads of results. I think temporality in this case is very important. So there's this move towards value for money in research. So producing as much as possible in the shortest possible time, with the most extensive research methods and all that. And I think that value for money aspect will structurally kind of reactivate all these things that I was talking about. So the underlying inequalities, the racialized hierarchies, and these types of things. But this is just my a few ideas on this. But please share ideas, because I know that a lot of people have experience, a lot of people who are present